Thank you very much. I've always wanted my own band. The Faith, Family, and Freedom Band. Didn't they do a great job?
Thank you.
The only thing missing is Ed McMahon, but we're going to have a great time tonight. I am so thankful you're here, and this is a true honor to be able to recognize Congressman Frank Wolf. About the second year into the Family Research Councils, and when we've got a coalition of groups that are part of the Values Voter Summit, but this is a kind of a special night that we carved out where we can recognize leaders, heroes, and we want to be able to look at them in the face and tell them how much we appreciate the work that they've done. Proverbs tells us not to withhold good from those to whom it is due. And tonight, we're going to do that. We're going to honor the life of a man, and the man who has lived a faithful life in advocating for others. Before I do that, I want to take a personal privilege on a couple of fronts. First, I want to recognize my wife, Luana Perkins, of 32 years, grateful for the sacrifices that she's made. I'm just going to ask her to stand. I'm going to ask you to thank her. Yes, she was 10 years old when I married her. No, actually, I'm not from Arkansas. No, that's true. No, wait. No. Moving right along. Earlier this week, the Family Research Council held its annual meeting of our board of directors. At our Wednesday evening dinner, we paid tribute to one of our longest-serving board members, Elsa Prince Brookhuizen, for a quarter century of service. And I just want to take a moment to thank Elsa for a quarter century of supporting, inspiring, and guiding and leading the Family Research Council as she now retires from the FRC board of directors. She and her late husband, Edgar Prince, were instrumental in the founding of the Family Research Council 35 years ago. And ever since, she has helped shape an organization that has fought day in and day out for faith, family, and freedom. In fact, Elsa is largely responsible for the building that we now occupy on G Street. And just so we don't forget why we're there, etched in the stone at the front of our building are the words faith, family, and freedom. And they're in that order. And Elsa, I assure you, we will never get them out of order. Faith, family, and freedom. Now, I've made her promise that even though she's retiring from the board, her and her husband, Ren, will continue to be faithful attendees at the Values Voter Summit every year. And I would like to ask my daughter, Grace, to come and just a small token of our appreciation, Elsa, for your service, not only to FRC, but to our nation. I heard a story of two men who were standing on a bridge, and one was about to jump off. The other man was trying to talk him out of it. And the man asked the jumper, he says, "Do you believe in God?" The jumper replies, "Yes." "So are you a Christian or a Hindu or a Jew or what?" the man asked the jumper. And the jumper replies, "I'm a Christian." Well, the man says, "Well, small world, me too. Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox?" The jumper says, "A Protestant." The man replies, "Well, me too. What denomination?" The jumper says, "Baptist." The man replies, "Well, me too. Southern Baptist or Northern Baptist?" The jumper says, "Northern Baptist." The man replies, well, me too. Northern Conservative Baptist or Northern Liberal Baptist? The jumper answers, well, I'm Northern Conservative Baptist. And the man replies, great, me too. Northern Conservative Great Lakes region or Northern Conservative Baptist Eastern region? The jumper answers, well, Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes region. And the man replies, well, me too. Northern Conservative Baptist Great Lakes Region Council of 1879 or Northern Conservative Baptist Lakes Region Council of 1912? The jumper replies, well, Northern Conservative Great Lakes Region Council of 1912. The man then pushes the jumper off the bridge and cries, die, heretic! Bringing unity to the church is often difficult. But even more so in uniting this city, Washington, D.C. But our honoree tonight, through a lifetime of consistent, selfless, yet passionate service to the persecuted, has helped unify many in the church, and yes, even brought unity to Congress on behalf of the world's persecuted populations. In fact, on this night 4 years ago, we honored Miriam Ibrahim with our inaugural Cost of Discipleship Award. You'll recall that she was the Sudanese mother who had been imprisoned and sentenced to die for refusing to renounce her faith in Jesus Christ. Frank Wolf was one of those who championed her cause and helped us on that occasion to honor her. And following the gala, he privately urged us to elevate religious freedom and persecution, to make it a defining issue in the 2016 presidential election. He was right. Again, a visionary. And as a result, we have an administration that has placed an unprecedented focus on both domestic and international religious freedom. This focus of the Trump administration has created an unparalleled opportunity to advance religious freedom both here in the United States and around the globe. We now have a president, a vice president, a secretary of state, an ambassador for international religious freedom, all committed to religious freedom as a top priority in our nation's domestic and foreign policy. It was Congressman Frank Wolf's unifying leadership 20 years ago that has set the stage for this unprecedented opportunity to bring hope and help to those around the globe who are being persecuted for their faith. Motivated by the dark years of Romania's repressive communist regime and the gulags of the evil empire, in 1998 he authored and Bill Clinton signed into law the International Religious Freedom Act. The law was recently amended and renamed the Frank R. Wolf International Religious Freedom Act. The law has elevated the importance and the priority of the promotion of religious freedom in America's foreign policy. It is no small matter that when people think of one person who most clearly embodies international religious advocacy in this era, they rightly think of Frank Wolf. And that is why we are gathered here this evening to honor Frank Wolf with FRC's 2018 Vision and Leadership Award. And to do that, we've invited a few folks who know him best and can speak to his extraordinary career and character. Our first speaker this evening is a longtime member of the FRC family. Her father, Gary Bauer, served as the president of FRC from 1988 to 1999, and he is with us tonight. He's one of our co-sponsors. Gary, would you stand up? Gary Bauer, there he is. Gary is also a commissioner on the International Commission, the Commission on International Religious Freedom. And I think Nadine Manza, who was here earlier, is also a commissioner along with myself. And that is a part of what Frank Wolf created in 1988. Elise Bauer Anderson has followed in her father's footsteps of advocacy, making her own impressive path on Capitol Hill and in the international religious freedom community. She was appointed by Senator Marco Rubio as staff director of the Congressional Executive Commission on China in February of 2017, after serving as deputy director since 2015. Elise previously served as foreign policy director for Frank Wolf from 2008 to 2015, Elise simultaneously served for a portion of that time as Republican staff director for the bipartisan Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which Congressman Frank Wolf co-chaired. She also held posts at the Freedom House's Center for Religious Freedom, the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Elise knows and understands religious freedom issues intimately, and Mr. Wolf credits her as the best writer in town alongside Peggy Noonan. Please welcome to the stage Elise Bauer Anderson.
That's how my kids greet me in the morning when I come down the stairs. Thank you, Tony. Good evening. It's a rare and unexpected privilege to have gathered in one place the three men who have most deeply impacted my life: my husband, my dad, and Congressman Frank Wolf. Tonight is an opportunity to honor the latter, though time constraints will only permit me to begin to scratch the surface. I first joined the Wolf Pack, the affectionate name for the vast group of alumni who worked for Congressman Wolf during his 34 years in public office, as an intern the summer of 1998. At the time, Congress was weighing whether to grant China most favored nation trading status, and Mr. Wolf was leading the opposition in Congress given China's grave human rights abuses. The coalition of organizations and individuals opposing this privileged trading status can best be described as a motley crew that defied party affiliations and pushed ideological boundaries. I would come to learn that Mr. Wolf specializes in such coalitions, adeptly finding common cause with the most unlikely of partners while holding fast to his principles. Among the daily visitors to our office were Chinese dissidents like Bob Fu, labor union representatives, Protestant house church pastors, and Tibetan Buddhists. It was a window into Mr. Wolf's consuming passion to advocate for the persecuted and speak truth to power, and I was hooked. That summer was the start of a journey that afforded me the life-altering opportunity to work for Mr. Wolf for the better part of a decade, including during his final 6 years in elective office. Congressman Wolf's lengthy and varied legislative accomplishments, some of which we've already heard, are well documented and well known, and we will most assuredly hear more about them from the speakers to follow. But I want to share with you just a few of the most storied and noteworthy. Mr. Wolf authored, as Tony mentioned, the landmark International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which enshrined the promotion of international religious liberty into U.S. foreign policy by creating the International Religious Freedom Office at the State Department, as well as the independent bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. He was the lead sponsor of legislation which created a special envoy position at the State Department dedicated to advocating for religious minorities in the Middle East and South Central Asia, including countries like Iraq, Egypt, and Pakistan, where Christians, Yazidis, Baha'is, and Ahmadiyya Muslims, among others, face daily persecution and violence. He famously traveled with Ambassador Sam Brownback, then a U.S. Senator, to Darfur, Sudan, where they sounded the alarm on what would come to be globally recognized as genocide. He snuck into Tibet with a group of trekkers to investigate Chinese Communist Party and government abuses of Buddhist monks, nuns, and others. And that's just the highlights reel. The two trips I just described are illustrative. The Washington Post editorial board, hardly a bastion of conservatism, penned a glowing op-ed upon Mr. Wolf's announced retirement, grudgingly noting his steadfast support of domestic issues at odds with the paper's own views, while also praising, quote, his unstinting advocacy for human rights and oppressed minorities in dangerous and unlovely corners of the globe that most members of Congress were content to ignore, end quote. Without question, his widely recognized legislative victories and willingness to champion the people who live and often suffer in dangerous and unlovely corners of the globe are praiseworthy feats worthy of the honor bestowed upon Congressman Wolf tonight. But what is perhaps lesser known outside of his family, close friends and colleagues, and longtime staff is Frank Wolf the man, and that is what I'd like to take a few minutes to speak to. The Post continued in its editorial describing Mr. Wolf as, quote, low-key, hardworking, detail-oriented, deeply religious, and lacking the spotlight-hogging loquacity of many of his colleagues, end quote. Much of that description is true. Mr. Wolf is low-key insofar as his personal humility stands in stark contrast to the preeminent idols of our nation's capital, namely pride and power. But his congressional office, as former staff will universally attest, was anything but low-key. There was an energy and urgency that flowed from the top down. If you were a staffer, you had better wear shoes that you could run in, since it was not uncommon to find yourself chasing down the hall behind Mr. Wolf with hearing materials or a floor speech in hand to catch up with him. He's a man in a hurry. When he wants something done, he usually wanted it 5 minutes ago. When he wanted somebody on the phone, be it the Secretary of State or the Director of the FBI, he wants them on the phone now. The bureaucracy and inertia that bogs down so much of Washington are an anathema to him, and millions of people the world over are better for it. He possesses a certain doggedness and unrelenting spirit that simply will not take no for an answer. He wants results, not intransigence, outcomes, not process, and consequently, he gets stuff done. His staff was loyal and committed because we knew we were part of something far bigger than ourselves. As driven as Mr. Wolf was by global challenges, he was strongly local as well, and not just in his effective advocacy for Northern Virginia transportation projects or federal employee issues. Rather, he cared about his staff as if we were an extension of his family. If you were a young man in the office who recently proposed to his girlfriend, you'd likely come to work one day and find a copy of Dr. Dobson's What Wives Wish Their Husbands Knew About Them mysteriously on your desk. If you were a new father, you could expect a copy of Dobson's Where's Dad? In a transient city, often marked by fickle and fleeting relationships, he took the time to genuinely care about our families, the health of our marriages, the well-being of our children, dare I say, our very souls. A voracious reader and student of history, Mr. Wolf has been influenced and shaped by Wilberforce and Dr. King, Madison, and of course Reagan. Any staffer helping to write his speeches or statements learned early on that they couldn't go wrong, including a quote from the Gipper. I'll never forget when we rediscovered a Reagan speech delivered on the 200th anniversary of the signing of the Constitution. Reagan quoted a scholar describing this preeminent founding document as a covenant. Quote, "A covenant we've made not only with ourselves, but with all of mankind." Congressman Wolf seized on this notion, for in many ways it perfectly captured his own reverence for this uniquely American calling. Mr. Wolf has an unrelenting commitment to the God-given radical dignity afforded every person as an image bearer of their Creator. He held that this covenant did not simply apply to the men gathered in Philadelphia during that sweltering summer in 1776, or even exclusively to future generations of Americans. Rather, it was a lasting covenant, unbound by time or geography, with men and women in dangerous and unlovely corners of the globe. While Congressman Wolf served in the U.S. House of Representatives for 34 years, he was never under any illusion that the political process or government systems alone were the solution. Much of his advocacy and, yes, admonition has been directed toward the American church. He has prayed for revival and for an awakening such that believers in the West would be stirred to action by the suffering of their brethren globally. Buttressed by profound encounters with the persecuted church, he too has counted the cost and is not content with a life of comfort. His abiding love for his country, his wife Carolyn, his 5 adult children and 16 grandchildren has not afforded him complacency even in retirement. Rather, since leaving Congress, he's continued to speak out and advocate for the oppressed overseas, while closer to home, he has worked to sound the alarm about the crisis of religious liberty we face in America. A Bauer family Christmas favorite is the classic Frank Capra film, It's a Wonderful Life, starring Jimmy Stewart in the role of George Bailey. I suspect the plot line is known to most of you, but for purposes of illustration, spoiler alert, George has the opportunity to see what the world would have been like had he never been born. It isn't pretty. The audience realizes through George's eyes that he indelibly shaped countless lives without ever leaving his small town of Bedford Falls, New York. At the film's end, we're left with the realization that one good and decent man or woman can have a lasting and eternal impact. Mr. Wolf's impact is similarly profound and yet global in scope. There are political prisoners halfway around the world who are free because of him. There are war criminals who've been brought to justice because of him. And there are families displaced by violence who can now return home because of him. Spiritual realities being what they are, true justice and lasting peace eludes us all this side of eternity, but Mr. Wolf's legacy in these pursuits is vast and remarkable. He has lived out Jesus' teaching, to whom much is given, much is required. A closing thought. Whatever the current crisis on which we were focusing on any given day in the congressional office, Mr. Wolf would often lament the lack of action in Washington and rhetorically ask some young staffer, "Where are the giants? Have they all left the field?" The answer to those of us who had the privilege of working for him was simple. The giant was right in front of us. Thank you.
Elise, very well done. I had the opportunity to visit Congressman Wolf in his office many times, and I can attest to the atmosphere there. It was certainly no museum for freedom. It was a construction site. There was always activity, and I had that same question. Where are the churches? Where are the leaders? Frank would ask me that question repeatedly. And Frank, you're one of those leaders. You're a leader of leaders. Not only is his staff, it's great when those that have worked for you speak so highly and praise you. It says a whole lot because they see you when things are good and when they're not so good. But there are also, as Elise said, there are those that around the world who, because of you, have tasted freedom. Joining us next to honor Mr. Wolf is one of the leading voices in the world for persecuted faith communities in China. Bob Fu was born and raised in mainland China and was a student leader during the Tiananmen Square demonstrations for freedom, for democracy in 1989. He was a house church leader in Beijing until he and his wife Heidi were in prison for 2 months for illegal evangelism in 1996. Bob and Heidi fled to the United States as religious refugees in 1997 and subsequently founded China Aid in 2002 to bring international attention to China's gross human rights abuses and to promote religious freedom and the rule of law in China. As president of China Aid, Bob has testified before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the Congressional Executive Commission on China, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and the European Union Parliament. Bob also regularly briefs the State Department and members of Congress on the status of religious freedom and the rule of law in China. Please welcome to the stage an incredible man of faith, Mr. Bob Fu.
Good evening. Thank you, Tony, for giving me this extraordinary privilege to make a testimonial to my hero, Congressman Frank Wolf. Of course, as a house church pastor, we also are used to the 3-point sermons. And I could not help but also summarize for the time being with my 3 points. Mr. Wolf, you are a man of conviction to me. Being a man of conviction, you chose to stand with the persecuted and oppressed, especially to tackle a gigantic country like China. That's a lonely cause. Many times I found you must be a very lonely wolf in Congress. From your unwavering conviction by opposing the renewal of the PNTR, the permanent normal trade status, to entry of WTO for the communist China. It's not a popular voice. It's not even popular among your own party. Yet you continued, you spoke up, you chose to side with those who are persecuted because you know that once China is given a free pass, once for all, with even an administration mobilizing over 1,000 staff from Commerce Department to White House to lobby Congress to give China a free pass, entered into WTO. You are fighting a very lonely cause. I wish, back to 20 years ago, 50%, let's say 20%, how about 10% of the member of Congress and the administration officials would listen to your lonely voice? What a different world today for America, for the world it could be when we tackle about China. Now, almost an uncontrollable monster. You are also teaching me that as a man of conviction, you care about everyone who are oppressed, persecuted for their faith, not only for your fellow Christians that I represent often, but you often, always, when I met with you, you said, how about the Tibetans? Have you talked to them? How about the Uyghur Muslims? How about the Falun Gong practitioners? How about the underground Catholics? And you can remember all their names who were disappeared for 20 years, 30 years. That really gave me the primary calling to work with others, supporting the religious freedom for all. And you are a man of courage, that you're not hesitate to call out what is true, what is evil. Even within your own party. Once again, I observed 1 year you call out our U.S. Ambassador Clark Rand to resign because he refused to meet with the dissidents in Beijing, refused to speak up for the persecuted faithful in China. Ambassador Rand is a classmate with President George W. Bush at the time. But you ultimately are vindicated. I think before that ambassador's term was expired, you found out that he ended up working as a lobbyist for a Chinese state-owned bank in Hong Kong. You are a man of action, as Elise just testified, and I can testify with first-hand knowledge. Whenever I organize delegations, maybe 5, 10 every year, you have never refused to open doors. You have never refused a meeting with those persecuted human rights lawyers, human rights defenders, house church pastors, dissident writers. Never. In fact, one time you called, asked me to submit some information. And I said, I really don't have enough time. He said, just tell Elise your district office in Washington, D.C. You call your office as China Aid District Office. I'm sorry to bother you so often. Make me really guilty sometimes. But the persecution continues. You are a man of action. I remembered 2008, before the Olympics in Beijing, and you are concerned that the Communist China would not deliver its promise to improve human rights, to improve religious freedom, to improve rule of law. So you and your fellow comrade, Congressman Chris Smith, decide to visit Beijing. I think your trip to Beijing has made the difference against all the odds, and knowing that you could be arrested. In fact, you can testify that when you were in the U.S. Embassy's car near the Tiananmen Square, you called me. I was in Midland, Texas, and you were telling me, said, Bob, we're about to go. I said, yeah, I remember. What's the things? I know we had a code of language. I've prepared some ways for you to protest over there. But maybe less than 20 minutes later, you received the U.S. Embassy's call, said the Chinese already protest, obviously listening to your phone call, and said, these two guys, if they dare to go to Tiananmen Square, they will be treated like Chinese, will be arrested immediately. You were a man of action at that time, still arranging your time, meeting with the persecuted church pastors, the human rights lawyers, although many of them were continue receiving the persecution today. Finally, you are also a man of compassion, a compassion that I can testify with my firsthand knowledge. I remember in 2002, when I learned my 70-year-old father was beaten up because of my advocacy work in the U.S., and I arranged emergent rescue work for him to flee to Thailand. It was already midnight, late evening. I called your aide, David DeTony. I said, could you ask Congressman Wolf to write a letter so that tomorrow I can fly to Bangkok to tell the UNHCR that my father was in danger, that he needs a UNHCR refugee status. In the middle of the night, from Congressman Wolf, signed a letter, faxed to my home, so that I can bring that to Thailand, to Bangkok. Within 2 days, 48 hours after my father was dramatically rescued in the Thailand airport, my father was granted as the UNHCR approved refugee. For those who know the efficiency of the UN or UNHCR, that's a real record, I think. Thank you, Congressman Wolf, for helping. Every time when you and I want to conclude with this, you always ask me, you said, Bob, when is the evil empire, maybe the second evil empire, will end? That's the toughest question for me as not a good prophet. But I can tell you, Mr. Wolf, that at least you should take comfort today that in the past 2 weeks, the Chinese persecuted are rising up. When China entered into a period that the persecution is the worst since the end of October Most Cultural Revolution, when Bible is being burned, when thousands of churches are being shut down, when hundreds of thousands of children were being forced to renounce their faith, the Chinese church is standing up finally. Up until today, we have 426 house church pastors sign up a manifesto openly, willingly, publicly, for the first time in the history of China under the Communist Party's rule. They demand freedom. They said, we are willing to pay the price. We refuse to obey this Communist Party's order. Maybe it will take some time, praise the Lord, to end this regime. But I can tell you, the regime's ending should be closer and closer. I count all of you, of course, when we come together. We know that together, working as like Congressman Wu's spirit of unity, we will finally end that evil empire. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. We are so grateful to have you and Heidi with us. And you're a good pastor, 3 points, but you wouldn't make a good Baptist because you didn't do an offering. Our next presenter is Ambassador Tony Hall, and he has been best friends with Mr. Wolf for around 35 years. So, actually, Tony, I'm expecting some pretty good stories. Their remarkable friendship began when they served together in Congress and were part of a small prayer group in the early 1980s. Friendships like theirs, quite frankly, are hard to find in Washington these days. Congressman Hall was a Democrat, and Congressman Wolf a Republican. It was Tony who invited Frank to visit Ethiopia during the famine and to Romania in 1985. For this, Frank credits his friend for getting him interested in human rights. 3 times nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, Tony Hall is one of the leading advocates for hunger relief programs and improving international human rights conditions in the world. In February of 2002, President George W. Bush asked him to serve as the United States ambassador to the United Nations Agency for Food and Agriculture. He is one of those people you just need to really Google later to read about the amazing work that he has done on behalf of those in need. It's evident that God has powerfully used the friendship of Tony Hall and Frank Wolf for his kingdom. So please give a warm welcome to Ambassador Tony Hall.
Well, thank you, Tony, and good evening. I'm very honored to be here and to say a few words about my good friend Frank. It's an easy thing to do because I know him very well and because he's very special, and he is a very, very good man. And at the same time, it's difficult because I only have a few minutes. Every week when Congress was in session for 30 years, over 30 years, Frank and I would get together every Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the chapel off the floor of the rotunda. Some of you maybe have seen that little chapel. And we would pray. And we would read the scripture, and we would talk about our lives, talk about how we could help one another, talk about the problems of the week, but really talk in a very, very personal way. You know, it's hard to get up after that and get mad with each other after you've prayed with each other, after you have established a relationship with each other. And because of that, Frank and I, in all these years, we never had an argument. We never got mad at one another. And we sometimes voted against one another. But we always trusted one another. And it's very interesting. I supported Frank in a lot of his campaigns. I even gave money to his campaign, much to the chagrin of the Democratic Party. My wife even volunteered and worked on his campaign. But over the years, as a result of praying together and just becoming good friends and trusting one another, we found a lot to agree on, especially family issues and human rights issues and hunger issues and many other issues. And Carolyn and my wife are good friends and to this day are in a prayer group together. I remember the first time that Frank and I went on a trip together. It was in Romania, and you've heard a little bit about it. And it was during the time of this terrible oppression of this communist government of Ceausescu, who was in power, and churches were really, excuse me, at that time, being bulldozed down. They were being bulldozed down in Romania. Excuse me. Thank you. Churches were being bulldozed down in Romania, and a lot of special groups had sent 100,000 Bibles to Romania, and the Romanian government had turned the Bibles into toilet paper. And I remember speaking in a church, and Virginia, one of Frank's daughters, was with him, and I'll never forget seeing Frank and the tears coming down his face because he was hearing his daughter, I believe for the first time, give testimony about her faith and her love of Jesus. And it was a most amazing experience to see that in this Romanian church that was so oppressed, but the faith was so strong. I mean, you could almost cut it with a knife. The faith of this church in Romania was just unbelievable. These people were under so much oppression. Frank's faith is his guiding light. And his second guiding light is his wife, Carolyn. He loves her. And he has an amazing family. They have done an amazing job with their children. And he's not afraid of anything. I mean, he is a bulldog. I've always called him a bulldog because when he grabs a hold of something, he doesn't let go. And he's the kind of guy that if you are in a legislative fight, you want him on your side. I remember many times we would sit in the back of the chamber of the House of Representatives, and we would oftentimes pray for each other. It seemed like I was always praying for Frank because he was always in trouble. He was always, because Frank is so strong and so, even though he's a humble man, he's so strong and he feels so strongly about issues that he will go after everybody, including people in his own party and the leadership in his own party. And I can remember many times him voting against his party, him voting against the leadership of his party, and I'd be back there praying for him because we didn't know what was going to happen to him. Frank is the kind of man that you really want on your side. He is amazing. On a lighter side, he's really good with a yo-yo. Yeah. You know the thing that goes up and down? I can remember being with him with some kids overseas, and I didn't realize that he was so good with the yo-yo, and he was doing, the thing was going down, and he was doing one of those things, you know, where the yo-yo goes between. He was doing a bridge and all that stuff, and it was amazing. Another thing that you need to know about him is he likes those teapots. You know, the ceramic things you pour tea out of? He loves them. If you want to give him a present, give him a teapot. It's a little bit strange, but the one thing about Frank is that he loves Jesus. And Jesus is his bullseye. And he believes in him, and he loves him, and he reads about him. And he believes he's the center. And he gets a lot of inspiration from him. And I just can't say enough about Frank. You know, Martin Luther said over 500 years ago, he said a very interesting thing. He said that we need to send our good people into the church we need to send our best into politics. In regard to Frank Wolf, we sent our best into politics. He's a great man, great friend, Frank Wolf.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now I know what to get Frank for Christmas. I'll see if I can get him a new yo-yo. But we are honored to have with us tonight our final presenter of the evening. In his career, he's had several positions of leadership, including U.S. Congressman, U.S. Senator, Governor of the great state of Kansas. But I believe in February of this year, he stepped into his most important role yet. In fact, I believe it was the role he was born for. When he was sworn in as Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, the position created by the International Religious Freedom Act in 1998, which was championed by Mr. Wolf. Sam Brownback is a longtime friend of mine, going back almost 2 decades. He's also a dear friend of Frank Wolf. The two of them have traveled the world together. We're part of the first group to visit Darfur and witness genocide firsthand. While in the U.S. Senate, he was a key sponsor of Mr. Wolf's International Religious Freedom Act. And I know he is delighted to be here with us tonight to honor his friend. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Sam Brownback.
Thanks, Tony. What a great evening, what a great place to be, and a wonderful chance for me to honor Frank Wolf, somebody that I love. This is a great man. Frank Wolf is the William Wilberforce of our generation. He really is. I don't say that lightly, I say that carefully, I say that thoughtfully, but it's true. He has done over a lengthy period of time the sort of great things that people around the world, millions of people around the world, are freer, are better because Frank Wolf served, because of his passion, because of his bullseye on Jesus and living that life, an elective life. He is the godfather of the current religious freedom movement in this country. He got it started over 20 years ago. The act, as you've heard, is named after Frank Wolf. He saw the need, he heard the cry, and he acted. And who can deny it? Frank saw it 20 years ago, but globally, I think it burst on the international scene in 2015 when 21 people were beheaded for their faith. 20 of them were Coptic Christians, beheaded, and one saw their faith and said, "Their God is my God," and was beheaded too. We hear about it. I hear about it all the time in my job. At the ministerial we hosted, we had a North Korean lady that had gotten out of her country, that was then trafficked, human trafficked, sold as a sexual concubine, got pregnant, was caught then and sent back into North Korea, and they gave her a forced abortion without anesthesia. We hear about it all the time. I meet with people on a daily basis about the persecution for their faith. And yet, people like Frank Wolf and efforts like this give them hope. I remember talking to a young North Korean man when the North Korean Human Rights Act was up, something that Frank Wolf also helped push. And he said in their villages, they started to hear these rumors around that somebody in the United States was interested in what was taking place in North Korea and that they were putting forward legislation for them. They started talking about it. It gave them hope. It gave them hope. You heard about it in China. Bob Fu's shaking his head over there. I hear about it all the time, that when the United States will act, it gives them hope and things move forward. And let me just say on behalf of this administration will not stop on the issue of religious freedom until the Iron Curtain keeping out religious freedom comes down around the world. We will not stop. We will not stop until the gates of religious freedom fly open around the world. As China grows in its oppression of its religious people, we will and are confronting them. When Turkey arrests and imprisons an American pastor, Andrew Brunson, this administration sanctioned Turkey, a fellow NATO member, that has never been done before, sanctioning a fellow NATO country because of what they have done. And their currency has dropped to a record low. The Economist magazine calls Andrew Brunson the most expensive prisoner in the world. And he's going to get more expensive. I've talked with Andrew Brunson a couple weeks ago, and what a beautiful man of faith. He's on house arrest now, and he doesn't want to go back to jail in the Turkish prison. But he says, whatever the calling is, he's up for it. His wife, Noreen, believes part of them being in prison, him being in prison, is so that the American people and others around the world will pray for Turkey. So, such selfless people. This administration hosted the first ever global ministerial about religious freedom. We had 84 countries, over 500 civil society and religious groups coming together to talk about one topic. Next year, we're going to do it again, and we're going to find a bigger space because we think the size will triple. There is so much need and interest in this topic. We have regional events coming up on different countries hosting freedom events on religious freedom. These acts by this administration follow the path trailblazed by Frank Wolf. Frank mentored me and many others on religious freedom, on human rights, on speaking up for the voiceless, on finding those odd coalitions of anybody that will agree with you to push these issues on forward. And he did it and continues to exemplify it. He and I traveled to Darfur together and witnessed that genocide as it was unfolding. But it wasn't just that. One other thing that I will be eternally grateful to him for is, as I'm coming in as a freshman congressman in the class of 1994, it was Frank Wolf that was lecturing our class about taking care of your family. This was the first time we'd taken over Congress in over 40 years. And we come in and we're all ready to go and to move forward and anxious about policy making. And Frank's emphasis to us, make sure you take care of your family. And it was an admonition we all needed and we all need now. God bless you, Frank Wolf. And I can guarantee there are people around the world today in huts and villages, in places that are gathering together quietly to pray because they're afraid of the authorities, that are whispering the name Frank Wolf. Frank Wolf. God bless you all.
Hebrews 13:3 tells us, "Remember those who are in prison, as though in prison with them, and those who are mistreated, since you also are in the body." Because our memories are weak, we often need reminding. And for the past few decades, there is one man who has helped us remember the suffering through his powerful, passionate service. Serving Congress from 1981 to 2015, no one has fought more valiantly and vigorously for the cause of religious liberty than the Honorable Frank Wolf. From the dark years of Romania's Ceausescu regime and the gulags of the evil empire, to the 5.5 billion people today living under oppressive governments, Frank's passion has led him around the world, standing with Christians, Tibetans, Buddhists, Baha'is, and others who have been persecuted for practicing their faith. The cries of the persecuted led Frank to author the International Religious Freedom Act, which President Bill Clinton signed into law in 1998. The law created the International Religious Freedom Office at the State Department, infusing religious freedom into U.S. foreign policy. It also established the bipartisan, independent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom as both a watchdog of repressive regimes and a truth teller to our own State Department. During his congressional tenure, he wrote legislation creating a special envoy at the U.S. State Department, advocating for religious minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia. He condemned the human rights abuses and persecution in China, Tibet, and Romania. He led the first congressional delegation to Darfur and sounded the alarm about the worsening plight of religious minorities, notably the ancient Christian communities in Iraq and Egypt. He founded and served as co-chairman of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which raises awareness about the international human rights issues. Widely recognized as the conscience of the Congress, he retired in 2015 to focus exclusively on human rights and religious freedom. Congressman Wolf said that as a follower of Jesus, he is called to work for justice and reconciliation and to be an advocate for those who cannot speak for themselves. In January 2015, he joined the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative as a distinguished senior fellow. In his memoir, Prisoner of Conscience, Wolf recounts his adventures around the world championing the rights of the persecuted. Frank once wrote, quote, "We need to be clear-eyed about the times in which we live, to be thoughtful about the challenges and prayerful about our response, and never be satisfied with allowing religious persecution to remain a global norm. Clear-eyed, thoughtful, prayerful, never satisfied with the status quo. That is Frank Wolf." It's now my privilege to present the Family Research Council Leadership Award to Congressman Frank Wolf. I'm going to ask Frank and his wife Carolyn if they would join me on the stage. I'm going to read the text. If you stand with me for just one moment, I'm going to read the text of the award. Throughout the history of the Western world, a handful of men and women have risen above the crowd to champion our first freedom, religious liberty. In the current era, no one has stood taller for that freedom than the Honorable Frank R. Wolf. From his position as one of the longest-serving members of Congress, continuing today as a co-founder of the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative, Frank Wolf has worked across religious traditions and political divides. As the driving force behind the introduction and enactment of the landmark International Religious Freedom Act 2 decades ago, Frank led the way on the most urgent issues of our time. He has traveled the globe encountering and encouraging oppressed religious minorities wherever their human rights have been ignored or trampled upon. Without fear or favor, Frank has spoken in behalf of members of the persecuted Baha'i faith, the Uyghurs in the People's Republic of China, the Yazidis in the community in Iraq, Christian minorities across the Middle East, and many more. His actions have elevated their plight and their rights to the forefront of international concern. Frank Wolf led the first congressional delegation to war-torn Darfur, awakening us all to the realities of genocide in Sudan. Along the way, Frank has exemplified what Wilberforce called the sobriety of spirit and the tenderness of conscience that marks the true Christian. He has remained, as he has said, clear-eyed about the times in which we live, thoughtful about the challenges we face, and prayerful about our response. Truly, he has used his liberty for the liberty of others. Throughout it all, in his private life and public service, he has been of one accord. He and his wife, Carolyn, have exemplified devotion to Jesus Christ and to the ideals of family. For this and for his continuing humanitarian engagement, Family Research Council is pleased to honor Frank R. Wolf with our Vision and Leadership Award, given this 22nd day of September in the city of Washington, D.C., in the year of our Lord, 2018. Can we get a picture?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I want to thank Tony Perkins, and I want to thank the Family Research Council, who I've always respected and really admired over the years. And I want to thank all of those who are here tonight and all those who have helped over the years. I accept this tonight on behalf of the staff, the great staff I have had over the years, and also on behalf of all the people whose names we probably don't know, who have done so much to kind of help on all of these issues. I want to thank Elise. Elise was one of the best staffers I ever had. I could give a whole speech on all four of these people. She writes like Peggy Noonan, and but I want to thank Elise for her comments. Brought a tear to my eye. I want to thank Bob. Bob has been in my office so many times. His faithfulness with regard to what's taking place in China. I'm going to talk a little bit about it tonight, but I appreciate Bob and his comments. I appreciate my good friend Tony Hall. On some of the tougher issues I had, I would talk to Tony before I even talked to my own leadership, and I cast one of the toughest votes, and Tony came on one side of me and Dan Coates came on the other, and I would not be here talking about these issues had it not been for Tony. He took me, he said, you got to go to Ethiopia in the famine, and he took me to Romania, so I want to thank him. And lastly, Ambassador Brownback. He was a congressman, he was a senator, he was a governor, and he said this is the best job he's ever had. He is like, I was reading today, he's like Esther for such a time like this. And I appreciate Ambassador Brownback and what he has done over the years, what he will do, and the difference that he can make with regard to this administration. Lastly, I want to thank my wife of 57 years. We've been married. If I had not married my wife, I would have been a claims adjuster at Geico, and not a very good one. Many of you know the words of the song, "The Boxer," that Simon and Garfunkel sang in Central Park. It says, "Man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest." There are the cries of the persecuted that we are refusing to hear. The Bible has much to say about persecution, oppression, and ultimately freedom. In Luke 4:18 and 19, Jesus is reading from Isaiah at the synagogue in Nazareth, and he says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, and recovery of sight for the blind, and to release the oppressed." In Ecclesiastes 4:1, he says, "Again I look, I saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of their oppressors, and they have no comforter." I stand before you tonight with a grave and growing sense of urgency regarding the erosion of religious liberty at home, and this is not the subject tonight, but at home and also abroad. All over this world, people of faith are denied the fundamental and unalienable human right to confess and express their faith according to the dictates of their conscience. According to Pew polling data, nearly 80%, it's gone up in the last 5 years, 80% of the world's population, over 5.5 billion people, at this very moment that we sit in this hotel, live in a religiously repressive country. Religious freedom has never been under more of an assault, both at home and abroad, than it is today. The task is urgent. The stakes are high. What remains to be seen is whether the people of God and people of goodwill will rise to the occasion for such a time like this. Throughout my career, I bore witness to the tragic state of religious persecution as a daily reality for so many people around the world. From China to Iran to Egypt, from Pakistan to Vietnam to Iran to North Korea. The face of repression varies, but the outcome is always the same: harassment, fear, imprisonment, and even death, simply because of what a person believes. In country after country, freedom of religion is indeed compromised, and Christians, to borrow a phrase from history, are in the eye of the gathering storm. Just look around the world today. Christians and Yazidis in Iraq were victims of genocide, and it took a long time for our nation, and many in the church never even raised the issue of genocide with regard to Christians and Yazidis. The reality hit home during trips I took to northern Iraq in 2014 and 2017, and again this past July. It's worth noting, and many people forget, the rich biblical history contained in these lands. With the exceptions of Israel, the Bible contains more references to the cities, regions, and nations of ancient Iraq than any other country in the world. The patriarch Abraham came from Ur in southern Iraq. Today, Abraham would have a difficult time surviving in Iraq. The account of Daniel in the lion's den took place in Iraq. Both Daniel and Ezekiel are buried in Iraq. A remarkable spiritual revival, as told in the book of Jonah, occurred in Nineveh, present-day Mosul. And 3.5 years ago, ISIS blew up Jonah's tomb, and there was almost not a peep out of the church in the West. Jonah would be hard-pressed to make it to Nineveh today. In 2003, Iraq's Christian population numbered 1.5 million. Today, roughly 200,000 remain, and maybe less. And 3,000, and Ambassador Brownback was there together a couple months ago, we heard that 3,000 Yazidi girls and women are still missing and still being held by ISIS, and we almost never hear about it from anybody in the West. I am encouraged by the recent actions of the Trump-Pence administration, which is helping Christians and Yazidis and other religious minorities return to the village. And what Tony said, and I completely agree, I don't want to take my hat off, Vice President Pence has done so much to help that has really made a tremendous difference. I'm also impressed with the work of AID Administrator Mark Green, who is doing so much to help these communities, to help these people to return to the villages where they want to live. There's much more that can be said about the persecuted people of faith in other countries. In Syria, the Christian population is dropping almost every day as the conflict continues. Today, the Apostle Paul could not safely travel the road to Damascus, and I almost never hear anybody in the church today say anything about it. In Egypt, we see continued persecution of Coptic Christians. Today, Joseph would be advised not to take Mary and baby Jesus to Egypt for safety, as he did in the days of Herod. In China alone, we see the Catholic Church being coerced and persecuted. Chris Smith, on one trip, took Holy Communion from Bishop Su. Bishop Su has never been seen again. And Protestant pastors and house church leaders are being jailed, and crosses are being taken down from Catholic and Protestant churches. And I've almost never heard any religious leader in the United States even comment about it, but for a few. And the Washington Post in September 17 tells how in China, every group is being persecuted because of their faith. Hundreds of thousands. Now the figure is 1 million Uyghur women and children and men are being taken from their homes and placed into re-education in detention camps. This is reminiscent of Mao. It's reminiscent of Stalin. And it's reminiscent of the Nazis. And yet the world is silent, and I almost have heard nobody in the church mention anything about it. And in Tibet, there's cultural genocide. They've literally gone into the city of Lhasa and stripped it. It's no longer a Tibetan city. And you now have 130, 140 Tibetan monks that poured kerosene on their bodies. They light a match to set themselves aflame in protest to the Chinese government. And there's almost no activity or comment in the West. In Pakistan, Christians are being persecuted, and the Catholic Pakistani woman, Asia Bibi, is on death row. She's been convicted of blasphemy and is on death row. And I haven't heard almost anybody in the West, in the church, comment about Asia Bibi. In Burma, and I appreciate Ambassador Brownback going there, the Rohingya Muslims are facing genocide, and also the Karen Christians are also being persecuted. In Nigeria, 21,000 minimum, some say it's 35,000, but better to go to the lower figure, 21,000 Christians have been killed by Boko Haram and Fulani militants. 900 churches have been burned and destroyed, and almost half of the Chibok Christian girls captured by Boko Haram are still being held captive. 4 years ago, April, prime ministers and presidents did hashtag bring back the girls. This April, I did not see one hashtag bring back the girls. The girls have almost been forgotten about. I was with one of the mothers of one of the Chibok girls when we were there, and she said, when we heard presidents and prime ministers doing this, we thought this would be the end and they would get out. Now it's 4 years and the girls have almost been forgotten about. We see growing anti-Semitism in many places around the world, and even here in the United States. The boycott, divestiture, and sanction movement, the so-called BDS, I believe personally, is really a soft form of anti-Semitism. However, with some notable exceptions, the church in America has not been seized by the crisis facing the church in so many countries. When I was in Iraq, to a person, when asked, every Christian we met expressed a pervasive sense of abandonment. One sister, Sister Diana, a Dominican nun, said, Mr. Wolf, does the West really care about us? In one particular camp I met, and Elise was there on this first trip that we took in 2015, we met a Christian man who had attempted to take his wife of 28 years to Mosul so she could continue to receive treatment for breast cancer. When they arrived at the hospital in Mosul, that's where ISIS blew up Jonah's tomb, they were met by an ISIS guard who refused to allow them entrance because they were Christian. They were told that the price for entrance and medical treatment was conversion to Islam. The wife refused. The husband refused. The couple, a construction worker and his wife, returned to their small village about 16 miles away. 10 days later, she passed away with her husband and 19-year-old and 8-year-old sons at her bedside. We asked the husband, we said, what were her last words? What did she say? He said the last words she shared were the following. She said, I'm going to hold on to the cross of Christ. I refuse to convert. I prefer death. I prefer death to abandoning my religion and my faith. She was 45. The Apostle Peter, my wife and I were in Israel a year and a half ago. We took some of our grandkids there. We were up in Capernaum, and the tour guide said, this is Peter's house, and Jesus ate with Peter in this house. Peter also saw Jesus walk on the Sea of Galilee. Yet Peter denied Christ 3 times. An Iraqi Christian construction worker and his wife did not deny Christ, although they never saw Christ. These courageous men and women of faith can't understand why the burning of churches, the forced conversions, and the emergence of a caliphate in the cradle of Christendom was not being met with urgency and action by fellow believers in the West. The persecuted church, I know, can seem a distant thing from our pews and our sanctuaries and our halls of government. But these brothers and sisters in the faith, they yearn for our prayers. In fact, is whenever you're with them and you leave, you say, what can we do? The first thing they say is pray for us. They yearn for our prayers, and they cry out for attention. Scripture, if we follow it, gives us little choice but to respond to their oppression. Jesus of Nazareth had much to say about the persecuted, the oppressed, and the imprisoned. But the question is the West today burdened by the great injustice of religious persecution? Does the church in America really care? Not because we're driven by guilt, but because we're motivated by our faith. Not because of some tired obligation, but because of a vibrant biblical mandate. The book of Hebrews enjoins us to remember those in prison as if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who were mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. And the book of Corinthians reminds us in the church that if one part suffers, every part suffers with us. The Old Testament book of Isaiah said, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfy the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise into darkness and your night will become like the noonday. I'm convinced that as those being persecuted become more than faceless and nameless victims in distant wars and hard-to-pronounce prison cells, that as we commit to knowing their stories and weeping at their wounds, interceding on their behalf through prayer and advocacy, that we will find ourselves shaped by these men and these women and these giants of the faith. And if we're clear-eyed about the times in which we live, I believe these encounters will make our own faith more robust and strengthen us for the days ahead. When asked why he continually spoke out against injustice, Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, if I remain silent, I may help my own soul. But because I do not help other people, I poison my soul. He said, silence never helps the victim. It only helps the victimizer. What a powerful statement. Silence never helps the victim. You always should speak out for the victim. It only helps the victimizer. In fact, silence actually encourages the wrongdoer to continue their acts of violence. In the 18th century, British parliamentarian William Wilberforce said this to his fellow countrymen about the evils of the slave trade. Wilberforce said, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you do not know. We in the West can never say we do not know what is taking place in Iraq, in the Middle East, and in China, and these other countries. Reverend Martin Luther King, and one of the most powerful things is to read Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail where he expresses grave disappointment with regard to the church. When I read King's letter, I almost feel like he's talking about today, the grave disappointment that I feel with regard to the church. Reverend King said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but we will remember the silence of our friends. Are we not friends of the persecuted in Iraq, in Syria, in Egypt, in China, in Pakistan, in North Korea, in Iran? And a quote often attributed to German Luther pastor and dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Bonhoeffer said not to speak is really to speak. Not to act, he said, really is to act. So, we can never again say we do not know. When we leave here tonight, let us commit that we will pray, that we will speak, and that we will act. Thank you very much.